The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, as Sarah McKenna hurried toward the marshal's office. Her left cheek bore a purple bruise that no amount of powder could hide, and her hands trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The scorching desert heat seemed to mock her desperate situation. There was nowhere to hide from either the sun or from Thomas. Marshal Jim Carson looked up from his desk as the door creaked open. Sarah stood silhouetted in the doorway, her once elegant Boston dress now faded and torn at the sleeve. Jim had seen that look before, the hollow eyes of someone who'd reached their breaking point. "Mrs. McKenna," Jim said softly, rising from his chair. "Please come in." Sarah glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping inside. "Marshal Carson, I need your help." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Jim gestured to the wooden chair across from his desk. "What happened to your face, ma'am?" "Thomas says I fell," she replied mechanically, then caught herself. "But I didn't fall, Marshal. He struck me with his riding crop because I questioned why he was gone for 3 days without word." The Marshal's jaw tightened. Thomas McKenna owned the largest ranch in the territory and wielded considerable influence. Jim had suspected for months that the man was abusing his wife, but without Sarah's testimony, his hands were tied. "This isn't the first time, is it?" Jim asked gently. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's getting worse. Yesterday he told me I belonged to him like his cattle or his horses. He said if I ever tried to leave..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "What did he say, Mrs. McKenna?" "He said he'd kill me first." The words came out in a rush. "And then he'd kill anyone who helped me." Jim leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "Ma'am, I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever you decide to do, I'll protect you." "You don't understand," Sarah said frantically. "Thomas owns half this town. Sheriff Martinez is in his pocket, and most of the town council owes him money. Who's going to believe a woman's word against his?" "I believe you," Jim said firmly, "and that's what matters." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made Sarah freeze. Through the window, Jim could see Thomas McKenna dismounting from his black stallion, his face twisted with rage. 3 of his ranch hands flanked him, their hands resting on their gun belts. "He followed me," Sarah gasped, shrinking back in her chair. Jim stood up, his hand instinctively moving to his Colt .45. "Stay behind my desk, Mrs. McKenna. Don't say a word unless I tell you to." The office door burst open without a knock. Thomas McKenna filled the doorway, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold gray eyes and a perfectly waxed mustache. His expensive leather boots clicked against the wooden floor as he strode inside. "Marshal," Thomas said with false civility, tipping his hat, "I've come for my wife." "Your wife came here of her own free will, McKenna," Jim replied evenly. "She's free to leave when she chooses." Thomas's eyes found Sarah cowering behind the desk. "Sarah, darling, you've caused quite a stir. Come along now, dinner's waiting." "I'm not going back with you, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. Thomas's facade cracked. "You belong to me," he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Till death do us part, remember. Those weren't just pretty words." Jim stepped between them. "That's enough, McKenna. Your wife has made her position clear." "My position?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "And what position would that be, Marshal? In this territory, a man's wife is his property, just like his land or his cattle. The law's on my side. The law protects all citizens from violence," Jim countered, "including wives from their husbands." Thomas moved closer, his breath hot against Jim's face. "You're walking on dangerous ground, Carson. I've got friends in high places, friends who could have you replaced faster than you can draw that gun." "Maybe so," Jim said calmly. "But today, in this office, I'm still the law." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah watched the 2 men face off, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether she lived or died. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls, carrying with it the promise of a storm. Thomas McKenna's hand slowly moved toward his gun belt, but Jim Carson was faster. In one fluid motion, the Marshal drew his Colt and leveled it at Thomas's chest. "I wouldn't," Jim said quietly. "Your ranch hands outside might be fast, but they won't be fast enough to save you." Thomas raised his hands slightly, a cold smile playing across his lips. "You're making a big mistake, Carson, bigger than you know. The only mistake would be letting you take Mrs. McKenna back to that ranch against her will." Deputy Pete Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his own weapon drawn. The young Mexican-American lawman had heard the commotion from the jail cells in the back. "Everything all right in here, Marshal?" "Just escorting Mr. McKenna out," Jim replied without taking his eyes off Thomas. "He was just leaving." Thomas straightened his vest and adjusted his hat. "This isn't over, Carson. Not by a long shot." He turned to Sarah, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Sarah, my dear, when you come to your senses, and you will, remember that I'm your husband. In the eyes of God and the law, you belong to me." "Get out," Sarah said, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "Just get out." Thomas's mask slipped completely. "You ungrateful—" He caught himself, glancing at Jim's unwavering gun. "We'll finish this conversation at home, wife." "No, we won't," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm not going back there. Not ever." After Thomas and his men left, kicking up clouds of dust as they rode toward the ranch, Jim holstered his weapon and turned to Pete. "Double the watch tonight. Post someone across from the hotel and another at the livery stable." "You think he'll try something?" Pete asked. "I know he will," Jim replied grimly. "Men like McKenna don't take no for an answer." Sarah stood up on shaky legs. "Marshal, I can't stay in this town. He'll never let this go." "Maybe if I left on the next stage." "Running won't solve anything, ma'am," Jim interrupted gently. "He'd just follow you, and next time there might not be a lawman around to help." "Then what do you suggest?" "I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." Jim thought for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything. He unpinned the silver star from his vest, the badge that represented his authority as town marshal, and held it out to Sarah. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused. "This badge represents the law in Copper Ridge," Jim explained. "As long as you wear it, you have my protection and my authority. Anyone who threatens you is threatening a sworn officer of the law." Sarah stared at the badge in disbelief. "I can't take this. What will people say? A woman can't be a lawman." "Says who?" Pete interjected with a slight smile. "I've seen plenty of men who couldn't handle the badge half as well as some women could." Jim pressed the badge into Sarah's trembling hands. "The law doesn't specify that marshals have to be men, Mrs. McKenna, and desperate times call for desperate measures." As Sarah pinned the badge to her dress, the weight of it felt like both a shield and a target. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the desert. That evening, word spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. At Murphy's saloon, men gathered around whiskey-stained tables, their voices hushed but heated. "A woman marshal? That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard," muttered Jake Morrison, one of Thomas's ranch hands. "Carson's lost his mind," agreed another patron. "What's next? Are we going to let Mexican kids run the bank too?" Pete, who had been nursing a beer in the corner, stood up slowly. "Careful with that talk, amigo. Some of us Mexican kids have been keeping this town safe while you've been drunk in here." The saloon fell silent. Everyone knew Pete Rodriguez was one of the fastest draws in the territory, but they also knew he faced constant prejudice because of his heritage. Meanwhile, at the McKenna ranch, Thomas paced in his study like a caged animal. His foreman, Buck Williams, sat across from him, nervously twisting his hat. "Boss, maybe we should wait this out. Let things cool down, sir." "Cool down," Thomas roared. "That woman humiliated me in front of half the town, and now Carson's made her some kind of deputy. This ends tomorrow, Buck, one way or another." Back in town, Sarah sat in the marshal's office, still wearing the badge. Jim had insisted she stay there for the night, sleeping on the cot in one of the empty cells for safety. "Marshal Carson," she said quietly, "why are you risking everything for me? You barely know me." Jim looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Because it's the right thing to do, ma'am, and because nobody deserves to live in fear." As lightning illuminated the desert outside, both Sarah and Jim knew that the real storm was just beginning. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Copper Ridge, the storm from the night before leaving the streets muddy and the air thick with humidity. Sarah McKenna stood at the window of the marshal's office, the silver badge catching the weak morning light. She had barely slept, jumping at every sound, the creak of wood settling, the scurry of desert mice, the distant howl of coyotes. Jim Carson entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and a plate of biscuits from Martha's kitchen. "Mrs. Henderson sent these over," he said, setting the food on his desk, "along with her support." "Her support?" Sarah asked, turning from the window. "Word's gotten around about what happened yesterday. The town's divided, but you might be surprised how many folks are on your side." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell walked in. The middle-aged physician was one of only 3 women in the territory, licensed to practice medicine, having fought her own battles for acceptance. "Mrs. McKenna," Dr. Hartwell said warmly, "I came to check on those bruises." She set down her medical bag and examined Sarah's face with practiced hands. "This one's healing well, but I can see older injuries. How long has this been going on?" 3 years, Sarah admitted quietly. Ever since we moved here from Boston. Dr. Hartwell's face hardened. No woman should endure this. She turned to Jim. Marshal, I'm formally documenting Mrs. McKenna's injuries. If this goes to court, we'll have medical evidence. Court? Sarah laughed bitterly. Judge Crawford is Thomas's poker partner. There won't be any justice in his courtroom. Maybe not, Jim said, but we follow the law even when others don't. The conversation was interrupted by shouting outside. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering in the street. Thomas McKenna sat atop his horse, flanked by 6 armed ranch hands. Across from them, a smaller group of townspeople had formed. Martha Henderson, Dr. Hartwell's husband Robert, the blacksmith Miguel Alvarez, and several others. Looks like we've got ourselves a standoff, Pete Rodriguez observed, entering with his rifle. Thomas's voice carried clearly across the street. I want my wife, Carson. This charade has gone on long enough. Jim stepped outside, his hand resting on his gun belt. Sarah followed, the badge on her chest feeling heavier with each step. Mrs. McKenna has made her choice, Thomas, Jim called back. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go. She's my wife, Thomas shouted, his face red with rage. The law says she belongs to me. The law also says no one has the right to beat another person, Dr. Hartwell interjected, stepping forward. I've documented evidence of repeated abuse. Thomas laughed harshly. The word of a woman doctor. Judge Crawford will throw that out faster than yesterday's newspaper. Martha Henderson, a stout woman in her 50s who ran the town's only restaurant, moved to stand beside Sarah. Maybe so, but this woman's got more courage in her little finger than you've got in your whole body, Thomas McKenna. More townspeople began choosing sides. Miguel Alvarez, the Mexican blacksmith whose skills kept the town running, brought his 2 grown sons with him. We stand with Marshal Carson, he announced in heavily accented English, but others sided with Thomas. Sheriff Martinez emerged from his office, adjusting his gun belt with obvious reluctance. Marshal Carson, he said formally, you're interfering with a man's legal right to his wife, and you're interfering with my duty to protect the citizens of this town, Jim replied coolly. The tension ratcheted higher when Buck Williams, Thomas's foreman, stepped forward. Carson, you've got till noon to hand over Mrs. McKenna. After that, we'll come and take her. Sarah felt her knees weaken, but the weight of the marshal's badge reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, her own strength. I'm not property to be handed over, she said, her voice carrying farther than she'd intended. I'm a human being, and I choose to stay here. Thomas spurred his horse closer. You belong to me, he snarled, his earlier pretense of civility completely gone. Till death do us part, remember? Those vows ended the first time you raised your hand to me, Sarah replied, surprising herself with her boldness. The crowd murmured at her words. Several women nodded approvingly, while some of the men shifted uncomfortably. Noon, Thomas repeated, wheeling his horse around. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Carson. As the McKenna party rode away, the gathered townspeople began to disperse. Some offered words of support to Sarah, while others avoided eye contact entirely. Dr. Hartwell squeezed Sarah's hand. You did the right thing, dear. Speaking up like that took real courage. Did it? Sarah asked, watching Thomas disappear into the distance. Or did I just sign all our death warrants? Jim placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sometimes courage and fear feel exactly the same, Mrs. McKenna. The difference is what you do with them. Pete checked his pocket watch. It's 8:30, Marshal. That gives us 3.5 hours to prepare. As they headed back into the office, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just crossed a line from which there was no return. The badge on her chest felt like both armor and target, and the approaching noon hour loomed like a gathering storm. Outside, the desert wind picked up, swirling dust devils through the empty streets. In a few hours, Copper Ridge would discover what it truly valued, justice or the easy peace that came from looking the other way. The clock on the wall of the marshal's office ticked toward 11:30 as Jim Carson methodically loaded his rifle. Sarah sat at the desk, her hands steady now despite the magnitude of what was coming. The marshal's badge caught the harsh desert light streaming through the window. You don't have to do this, Jim said quietly, not looking up from his weapon. Pete and I can handle McKenna and his men. You could slip out the back, take a horse, and be halfway to Tucson before they knew you were gone. Sarah shook her head firmly. Running away won't solve anything. If I leave now, Thomas will just find another woman to terrorize, and you'll have risked everything for nothing. Pete Rodriguez entered through the back door, his face grim. I counted 8 of them setting up positions around the saloon. McKenna's got himself a small army. 8 against 3, Jim mused. I've faced worse odds. 4, came a voice from the doorway. Miguel Alvarez stepped inside, his eldest son Carlos beside him. Both men carried hunting rifles. "My boy and I, we fight with you." "Miguel, I appreciate the offer, but no," the blacksmith interrupted, his accent thick with emotion. "For 20 years I live in this town, work hard, pay taxes, raise my family, but still some people, they look at me like I don't belong. You and Deputy Rodriguez, you treat me like a man with respect. Now I fight for what is right." Before Jim could respond, Dr. Hartwell appeared with her husband Robert, who carried an old cavalry carbine. "Elizabeth patched up half this town over the years," Robert said. "Seems only right we return the favor." Martha Henderson arrived next, surprising everyone by carrying a shotgun. "Don't look so shocked, Marshal. I didn't survive 3 husbands and 2 Indian raids by serving tea and cookies." By 11:45, a dozen townspeople had gathered in the office. The tide was turning, but Jim knew Thomas wouldn't back down. Men like him never did. "Listen carefully," Jim addressed the group. "Thomas McKenna is desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. Some of you might not make it home for dinner tonight. Anyone who wants to leave, do it now. No one will think less of you." No one moved. Sarah stood up, the badge glinting on her chest. "I need to say something." The room fell silent. 3 days ago I was a woman so beaten down I couldn't look at my own reflection. Today, because of all of you, I remember who I used to be. Whatever happens out there, you've already given me back my life. At exactly noon, the church bell tolled as Thomas McKenna and his men rode slowly down Main Street. The town had cleared except for those who'd chosen to stand with Jim Carson. They took positions behind overturned wagons, in doorways and on rooftops. Thomas called out from horseback, "Carson, time's up! Send out my wife!" Jim stepped into the middle of the street, Sarah beside him. The badge on her chest caught the brutal noon sun like a mirror. "Mrs. McKenna is exactly where she wants to be, Thomas. If you want to leave town peacefully, now's your chance." "Peacefully?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You've turned my own wife against me, made me a laughingstock in front of the whole territory. There's no peace to be had here." Sheriff Martinez appeared at the far end of the street, but instead of supporting Thomas as expected, he stopped and raised his hands. "That's enough, McKenna. I may owe you money, but I won't be part of this madness." Thomas's face twisted with rage. "You're all against me. Fine. Buck, take them down." The street exploded into chaos. Buck Williams drew first, but Pete Rodriguez was faster. The foreman spun and fell as Pete's bullet found its mark. Carlos Alvarez's rifle barked from behind a water trough, dropping another ranch hand. Sarah ducked behind a wooden post as bullets splintered the wood around her. She saw Dr. Hartwell bandaging a wounded townsperson, while her husband returned fire with methodical precision. Thomas, still mounted, charged directly at Sarah with his pistol drawn. "You belong to me," he screamed. Jim threw himself between them, his own gun blazing. Thomas's shot went wide, but Jim's didn't. Thomas McKenna tumbled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The remaining ranch hands, seeing their boss wounded and half their number down, threw down their weapons. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. As the gun smoke cleared, Sarah knelt beside Thomas, who lay bleeding in the dust. His face was pale, but his eyes still burned with hatred. "This isn't over," he whispered. "A man's wife belongs to him, that's the natural order." Sarah removed the marshal's badge from her dress and held it where Thomas could see it clearly. "The natural order is changing, Thomas, and men like you are going to be left behind." Dr. Hartwell arrived to tend to Thomas's wound. "He'll live," she announced, "though he might wish he hadn't when he stands trial for assault and attempted murder." Jim helped Sarah to her feet. "You did good today, Mrs. McKenna, real good." Sarah looked around at the townspeople who had risked their lives for her. Miguel and Carlos Alvarez, Martha Henderson, Dr. Hartwell and her husband, Pete Rodriguez, and Jim Carson. These people had become her family in a way Thomas never could. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we rebuild," Jim replied, pinning his badge back on his vest. "And we make sure this town is a place where everyone can live without fear." As Thomas was loaded into a wagon to be taken to the territorial prison, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The desert wind that had seemed so hostile before now felt like a promise of new beginnings. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting Copper Ridge in shades of gold and amber. For the first time since coming to this harsh land, Sarah McKenna felt like she was truly home. 3 months had passed since the gunfight on Main Street, and autumn had brought cooler winds to Copper Ridge. Sarah McKenna sat on the porch of the small house she now rented behind Dr. Hartwell's clinic, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in brilliant oranges and purples. The bruises had long since faded, but more importantly, the fear in her eyes had been replaced by quiet confidence. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Jim Carson stood there, hat in hand, looking unusually nervous for a man who'd faced down armed outlaws. "Evening, Mrs. McKenna," he said formally. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Marshal. Please sit." She gestured to the chair beside her. "And I've told you before, call me Sarah." Jim settled into the chair, still holding his hat. "I came to tell you the news from the territorial court. Thomas's trial concluded yesterday." Sarah's hands tightened slightly on her shawl. "And? Guilty on all counts. Judge Morrison from Phoenix presided. Couldn't have Thomas's poker partner Crawford hear the case. 5 years in Yuma Territorial Prison for assault, attempted murder, and intimidation of witnesses." Sarah exhaled slowly. "It's really over then." "The legal part is," Jim agreed. "But I wanted to ask you something else." He turned to face her fully. "The town council met last week. They voted to make some changes." "What kind of changes?" "They want to hire a second deputy. Someone who understands what folks go through when they can't defend themselves. Someone who's proven they've got the courage to stand up for what's right." Sarah stared at him. "Jim Carson, are you offering me a job? A real job this time, not just borrowing my badge. The pay's not much, but it comes with a house and the respect of decent folks." Jim's voice grew softer. "Though I'll admit, my reasons aren't entirely professional." Before Sarah could respond, Pete Rodriguez appeared around the corner, grinning widely. "Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't wait to hear your answer, Mrs. McKenna." "Pete Rodriguez, were you eavesdropping?" Sarah asked with mock severity. "Maybe a little," Pete admitted sheepishly, "but the whole town's been wondering if you'd take the job. Miguel Alvarez already offered to make you a custom badge, and Martha Henderson's been planning a celebration dinner." Sarah looked between the two men who had risked everything to protect her. "You're serious about this? A woman deputy in Arizona Territory?" "Dead serious," Jim replied. "We've already got approval from the territorial governor. Turns out having a woman in law enforcement isn't as unusual as folks thought. There's a lady sheriff up in Colorado and a female deputy in California. Besides," Pete added, "you've already done the job once, might as well get paid for it." That evening, the three of them walked to Murphy's saloon, where word of Sarah's decision had already spread. The establishment had changed considerably since Thomas McKenna's influence had been removed. Miguel Alvarez's son, Carlos, now worked there as a bartender, and the atmosphere was more welcoming to the town's Mexican-American residents. Dr. Hartwell raised her glass of sarsaparilla. "To Deputy Sarah McKenna, may she bring justice and compassion to those who need it most." The assembled crowd cheered. Sheriff Martinez, who had redeemed himself by testifying against Thomas, shook Sarah's hand warmly. "Welcome to law enforcement, Deputy. This town needs more people like you." Martha Henderson bustled over with a plate of her famous apple pie. "This calls for a celebration. First slice goes to our new deputy." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself in conversation with Maria Alvarez, Miguel's wife, who had been largely silent during the crisis 3 months earlier. "I wanted to thank you," Maria said quietly in accented English. "What you did, standing up like that, it gave courage to my family, to others like us. We see now that this town can be home for everyone. We all stood up together," Sarah replied. "That's what made the difference." "See, but you showed us how. A woman finding her voice. It inspires other women, other families who feel like outsiders." Later, as the celebration wound down, Jim walked Sarah home under a canopy of desert stars. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. "Are you sure about this?" Jim asked as they reached her porch. "Being a deputy won't be easy. There'll always be folks who think a woman doesn't belong in law enforcement." Sarah touched the new badge pinned to her jacket, a silver star identical to Jim's. 3 months ago, I couldn't imagine standing up to my own husband. Tonight I'm a sworn officer of the law. If I can make that journey, I think I can handle whatever comes next. And if things get dangerous again?" Sarah smiled, remembering the frightened woman who had stumbled into the marshal's office that sweltering afternoon. "Then I'll face it the same way I faced Thomas, with good people beside me and the law at my back." Jim nodded, satisfied. "In that case, Deputy McKenna, I'll see you at the office bright and early Monday morning. We've got a territory to keep safe." As Sarah watched him disappear into the shadows, she reflected on how much had changed. Copper Ridge was still a frontier town with all its challenges, But it was becoming something better, a place where justice mattered more than wealth, where courage was valued over compliance, and where a woman could remake herself into whoever she chose to be. The desert wind that had once seemed so hostile now felt like an old friend, carrying with it the promise of new adventures and the satisfaction of knowing she had found her place in the world. Sarah McKenna, Deputy Marshal of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, was finally home. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Sarah smiled. She was no longer afraid of the wild sounds of the desert night. After all, she had become part of the wilderness herself, untamed, resilient, and free.